I'm 82 years old, and my father has been dead for 12 years. I avoided him for 35 of my own, and by the time I finally understood him, there was no one left to say it to. I'm not telling this because I want sympathy. At my age, that doesn't matter much. I'm telling it because I've run out of reasons to keep it quiet. When you get to the end of things, you start looking back more than forward, and some memories don't let you rest. I live in a small house now. It's quiet in a way that isn't always comforting. My wife passed 3 years ago. The kids call, but they have their own lives. Most days I sit in the same chair by the window and watch the light change across the floor. It gives me time to think. I think about my father more than I used to. When I was young, I thought I knew exactly who he was. I thought he was a hard man, distant, quick to judge, slow to praise. I thought he chose silence because he didn't care enough to speak. It took me most of my life to realize I might have been wrong. I was 23 when I left home for good. I told people it was because I got a job in the city, which was true. I said it like it was opportunity pulling me forward, but there was something else pushing me from behind. He and I never fought loudly. That might have been easier. Instead, we disagreed in quiet ways. He believed in staying put, in doing steady work, in not drawing attention to yourself. I believed in getting out, in proving something, though I'm not sure now what that something was. He worked at the same factory for 42 years. Same shift, same lunch pail. He'd wake before dawn, shave carefully, and leave without much conversation. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't mean. He was just contained. I remember once, when I was about 16, I told him I wanted to study art. I'd been sketching in my room at night. I wasn't bad. At least that's what my teachers said. I showed him a drawing I was proud of. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "You'll need something steady." That was it. Not a shout, not an insult, just a statement. I heard it as dismissal. I heard it as, "That's foolish." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't ask why. I just folded the paper and stopped showing him anything that mattered to me. Years later, I would replay that moment and wonder what he had been trying to say. But at 16, you don't wonder. You decide. When I moved to the city, he shook my hand instead of hugging me. That bothered me more than I admitted. My mother cried. He stood by the door and said, "Call when you can." I told myself I would. At first I did, once a week, then once a month, then only on holidays. The calls were short. He'd ask about work. I'd give him quick answers. He'd say he was fine. I'd say I was busy. We both left things unsaid. I built a life. I got into advertising. Not art exactly, but close enough that I could tell myself I hadn't given up completely. The hours were long. The work was demanding. I liked the feeling of being needed. I liked when people praised my ideas. It felt like proof. When my father retired, I didn't go to the small dinner they held at the factory. I had a client meeting. That's what I told myself. It seemed important at the time. I sent a card instead. He didn't mention it the next time we spoke. My mother tried to keep the connection alive. She'd say, "He asks about you." She'd tell me small details, that he'd fixed the fence, that he'd started reading in the evenings, that he'd taken up walking around the block after dinner. I'd nod into the phone and say I was glad. There were chances to visit, weekends when I could have driven the 3 hours back home. But something in me resisted. I told myself it would be awkward, that we didn't have much to say, that we were too different. Avoidance doesn't feel like a decision at first. It feels like postponement. You tell yourself you'll make it right later. Later becomes a habit. When I got married, he came to the wedding. He wore a suit that looked slightly too big, like he wasn't used to dressing up. He shook hands with my friends. He smiled politely. During the reception, I caught him watching me from across the room. I remember thinking he looked proud, but I brushed that thought aside. It didn't fit the story I had about him. He held my first daughter in his arms. He was careful, like he'd been with me, I imagine. He told her she had strong lungs. That was his way of saying she was healthy. We saw him a little more when the children were small. My wife liked him. She said he was gentler than I described. I told her she didn't know him the way I did. Maybe I didn't know him the way I thought. The distance grew slowly. It wasn't a dramatic break. It was missed birthdays because of deadlines. It was Christmas visits shortened by work calls. It was choosing to stay in the city during a summer when he'd had minor surgery because I was the middle of something. He never complained. That almost made it easier to stay away. I told myself he preferred it that way, that he didn't like fuss, that he was fine. When my mother died, I came home for the funeral. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically smaller, just reduced somehow. Quieter. We sat at the kitchen table after everyone left, the same table where I'd eaten cereal before school. The wallpaper was faded. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. He said, "It's strange without her." I said, "I know." That was the longest conversation we'd had in years. I could have stayed that weekend. I could have taken a few days off. Instead, I left Sunday morning. I told him I'd call soon. I didn't call soon. After that, he lived alone. He learned to cook simple meals. He kept the house neat. Neighbors checked in. My sister, who stayed closer, visited more often than I did. I told myself that was enough. He and I spoke maybe once every couple of months. The conversations were almost formal. He'd ask about the children's school. I'd ask about his health. We stayed on safe ground. Then one evening, I got a call from my sister. She said he'd fallen in the yard, broken his hip. They were taking him to the hospital. I drove down that night. I remember the road was dark, and I kept thinking about how long it had been since I'd made that drive without a holiday as an excuse. He was in a hospital bed, pale but awake. When he saw me, he nodded, not surprised, just steady. "You made it," he said. Those words have stayed with me. Of course I made it, but I hadn't, not really. Not for years. The surgery went well. The recovery was slow. He needed help around the house after he was discharged. I arranged for a nurse to come by. I handled paperwork. I did what needed to be done. It felt responsible. It felt like I was finally stepping up, but responsibility is not the same as closeness. One afternoon, while I was there, he asked me to bring him a box from the closet. It was old, worn at the corners. Inside were papers. Some of them were mine. Report cards, old drawings, a program from my high school graduation. Things I didn't even remember giving him. He held one of my sketches, the kind I used to make in my room at 16. He said, "You were always good with your hands." I didn't know what to say. I had spent decades believing he thought it was foolish. "I kept these," he added. "Figured you might want them someday." There was no accusation in his voice, no hint that I'd been wrong about him. Just a quiet offering. That was the first crack in the story I'd been telling myself. Over the next few weeks, as he recovered, we talked more than we had in years. Real talks. Not long, but real. He told me about the factory, about how he'd once wanted to leave too when he was my age, about how his own father had gotten sick and he'd stayed to help at home. He said, "I thought I was protecting you. When I told you to find something steady, I didn't want you to feel stuck like I did." I sat there, feeling something shift inside me. All those years I had heard, "You can't." What he meant was, "I'm afraid for you." He wasn't a man who explained himself easily. He showed love by staying, by working, by keeping the lights on. I had wanted words. He had given structure. We had 35 years of distance between us. You don't erase that in a few conversations. But something softened. I started visiting more often, not because of duty, because I wanted to understand, because I finally realized he had a story too. We didn't get much time. About a year after his fall, He developed pneumonia. It moved quickly. He was in the hospital again, weaker this time. I sat by his bed one night. The machines made quiet sounds. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. He said, "I'm glad you're here." That was it. Not a speech, not a confession, just that. I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to apologize for the years I'd stayed away. I wanted to tell him I understood now, that I saw him differently, but the words felt clumsy. I said, "Me too." He died 2 days later. The house was sold, the belongings sorted. Life continued the way it always does, even when someone you finally began to understand is gone. The part that's hardest isn't that he died. He was old. I was old enough to know that was coming. The hardest part is knowing how long I misunderstood him. How many years I carried a version of him that wasn't entirely true. How many visits I postponed because I believed we had nothing to say. Time doesn't give refunds. I can't go back to that kitchen table when my mother died and choose to stay. I can't go back to that 16-year-old boy and ask his father what he meant. I can't sit in that wedding hall and walk across the room to tell him I was glad he came. Those moments are fixed. Now, when I think about him, I don't see the hard man I described for so long. I see a young father who didn't have the language I wanted. I see a man who kept my drawings in a box. If you're listening to this, I won't tell you to rush out and fix everything. Life is more complicated than that. People are complicated. I will only say this: sometimes what feels like indifference is fear. Sometimes silence is just a lack of practice with words. I wish I had asked more questions, not to challenge him, just to understand. If this meant something to you, maybe let it sit for a while. That's enough. I don't know how many years I have left. At 82, you start counting differently. Days feel longer, but time feels shorter. I think about my father when the house is quiet. I think about how he said, "You made it," and how I finally did, just a little too late. That's the truth of it. I spent 35 years avoiding my father, and he died before I fully understood him. I carry that with me now, not as punishment, just as something real. And at my age, real is all that's left.